The call came in just after sunrise, the radio crackling with that familiar flat urgency that never quite conveyed what waited at the other end. Missing hiker, overnight exposure likely, last ping near a service road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Nothing unusual on paper. We'd had 3 similar calls that month alone. The forest has a way of thinning people out quietly, especially when they assume distance is something they can outrun. I logged the details, finished my coffee without tasting it, and headed out with the rest of the team as the morning fog still clung low between the trees. Search and rescue work is 90% routine and 10% dread. The routine is what keeps you steady. Radios checked, packs weighed, routes planned, contingencies noted. The dread lives in the quiet spaces between those steps, in the knowledge that the forest doesn't care how well prepared you are. As we drove deeper along the access road, the trees closed in gradually, the world narrowing to a tunnel of damp earth and shadowed trunks. The fog thinned as the sun climbed, but the light never fully reached the ground, filtered and muted in a way that made time feel less precise. We parked where the road ended and continued on foot. The terrain was familiar enough. Mixed pine and fir, uneven ground. Old game trails cutting through undergrowth, but there was something subtly off about the area. Not dangerous, just unsettled. The kind of place where sound doesn't carry the way it should. Where footsteps feel slightly delayed, like the forest is listening before it responds. No one mentioned it. We rarely do. Experience teaches you which instincts to trust and which ones to file away until they make sense. We found the body less than an hour in. He was lying on his back near a shallow ravine, one arm bent awkwardly beneath him, eyes open and unfocused on the gray canopy above. No obvious trauma, no blood, just stillness. Exposure, most likely. Hypothermia can take people quietly if they're tired enough. His clothes were intact, gear scattered nearby, as if he'd sat down to rest and never gotten back up. It should have been straightforward. It wasn't. I knelt beside him to check for signs of life out of habit, even though I already knew. Cold, too cold. Rigor had set in, but not as fully as I would have expected, given the reported timeline. I reached for his wrist, noting the watch automatically, and that was when the first prickle of unease settled into my spine. The watch face was intact, glass uncracked, second hand moving smoothly. The minute hand was not. It was frozen at 2:17. I told myself it meant nothing. Mechanical failure. Cheap components. I'd seen worse. Still, I checked my own watch without thinking. The time read 9:42 a.m. I glanced back at his. The second hand continued its steady sweep, ticking off time that the rest of the watch refused to acknowledge. I straightened slowly, scanning the area for anything else out of place. That was when I noticed his face. Not the expression death tends to erase those distinctions, but the familiarity. It crept up on me gradually, a nagging sense of recognition that didn't immediately resolve. I'd seen a lot of bodies over the years. They blur together eventually. This one didn't. The lines around the eyes, the shape of the nose, the faint scar near the jawline. My mind insisted I'd seen him before, not in passing, not fleetingly, but clearly. I asked for his ID. One of the team retrieved his wallet from a jacket pocket and handed it to me, without comment. I flipped it open, already bracing for the answer before I consciously knew why. The name hit me harder than it should have. Evan Mercer. The world didn't stop. It didn't tilt, or blur, or announce anything dramatic. It simply tightened, like a room with all the windows closed. I stared at the card longer than necessary, my brain rifling through memory with increasing urgency. Evan Mercer, missing person, closed case. I remembered the file. I remembered the photo. I remembered signing off on it. That can't be right, I said, more to myself than anyone else. What? Someone asked. I didn't answer. I pulled my phone out with hands that had gone suddenly clumsy and opened the internal database, navigating to archived cases. The signal was weak but usable. A few seconds later, the screen loaded. Mercer, Evan, missing. Declared deceased. Recovered remains. Partial. Date of recovery, 6 years earlier. I looked up from the phone and back at the body lying in front of me. Same face, same scar, same man. I forced myself to breathe slowly, evenly, grounding myself in procedure. Mistakes happen. Names get reused. Facial similarity is a trick of stress and expectation. But the weight of certainty settled in regardless, heavy and immovable. I had stood in a different forest 6 years ago, staring down at another body, this same body, weathered and incomplete after weeks of exposure. I remembered the smell, the paperwork, the family notification. I remembered thinking, back then, that it had been a mercy we found anything at all. This man was whole. "You okay?" one of the rangers asked quietly. I nodded automatically. Yeah, just. Didn't expect him to be this intact. It was a lie, but an easy one. No one pushed. They trusted me. That made it worse. We completed the recovery in silence, lifting the body onto a stretcher, securing it with practiced efficiency. I avoided looking at his face as much as possible, focusing instead on details that made sense. The scuffed boots, the dirt beneath his fingernails, the way his pack straps were worn from use. Real things. Normal things. When we lifted him, his jacket shifted slightly, and I saw something that made my stomach drop. A laminated trail pass clipped inside the lining. Issued 3 days ago. The return hike was quieter than the walk-in. Radio stayed mostly silent, conversation clipped and practical. I replayed the details in my head obsessively, searching for an angle that didn't require the impossible. Administrative error. Misidentification. Someone with the same name, similar appearance. But every explanation fell apart under even mild scrutiny. I knew that face. I knew that file. I knew what I'd seen 6 years ago. Back at the staging area, I pulled the coroner aside and asked him to check the watch, the ID, the trail pass. He raised an eyebrow but complied, his professional detachment intact. When he looked back at me, something had shifted in his expression. "This doesn't make sense," he said quietly. "Body condition suggests less than 24 hours post-mortem. But if this is who you think it is," "It is," I said. "I'm sure." He hesitated, then nodded. "Then we've got a problem." The paperwork was a nightmare. The system flagged the name immediately, locking the report until discrepancies were resolved. I spent hours cross-referencing records, pulling old files, scanning photographs that made my pulse spike every time I confirmed what I already knew. Same dental records, same fingerprints, same man. Someone upstairs called it a clerical issue and told us to proceed with caution. Someone else suggested identity theft. No one said the word impossible. Not yet. I drove home that night with the image of Evan Mercer burned into my mind, the stillness of his eyes following me through every curve of the road. The forest pressed in close on either side, dark and impenetrable, headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the trees. I checked my watch compulsively, flinching every time the minute hand passed to 17 without incident. Sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it brought dreams that felt less like dreams and more like rehearsals. I stood in a clearing, watching the same man walk toward me from different directions. Each version slightly altered, one limping, one bleeding, one whole, and alert. They all stopped at the same distance, all turned their heads in unison, all opened their mouths to speak. I woke with a gasp, heart racing, the echo of my own name ringing in my ears. The next morning, before the report could be escalated further, another call came in. Lost hiker, same area. Name withheld pending confirmation. I felt a cold certainty settle into place before the radio even finished crackling. When we found him, he was alive. He was sitting on a fallen log, just off the trail, breathing hard but otherwise unharmed. Same face, same scar, same eyes. When he looked up at us, relief flooded his expression, followed immediately by confusion. "Thank God," he said. "I was starting to think you weren't coming back this time." I froze. "What do you mean, this time?" I asked. He looked at me more closely then, his brow furrowing. "You don't remember?" he said slowly. "You were there last time. You told me to stay put." My watch vibrated against my wrist. The minute hand slid forward. 2:17. He knew my name, not in the casual way people sometimes do when they've overheard a conversation or glanced at a badge, but with a familiarity that carried weight, like a word used often enough to wear grooves into the tongue. Evan Mercer looked up at me from the fallen log, his expression caught between relief and mild irritation. as if I'd arrived late to something we'd already agreed upon. The rest of the team stood behind me in a loose semicircle, radios quiet, boots shifting slightly in the dirt as they waited for cues I wasn't giving. "You told me to stay put," he said again, slower this time, watching my face closely. "Said you'd be back once you got reception." I felt every eye on me. Felt the pressure to respond with something that made sense, something that didn't fracture the fragile normalcy holding the moment together. Training kicked in automatically, muscle memory overriding panic. I crouched in front of him, keeping my voice even professional. "Let's take it one step at a time," I said. "How long do you think you've been out here?" He frowned, glancing up at the canopy, as if the answer might be written in the branches. "An hour, maybe 2. I took a wrong turn, tried to backtrack, realized my phone wasn't working. Then you showed up." He paused again. My stomach tightened. Again. "Yeah." He hesitated, then laughed nervously. I think so. I don't know. Things get weird out here after a while." I asked him to stand. He did, steady on his feet, no signs of hypothermia or dehydration beyond mild fatigue. His gear was intact, his pack stocked like he'd just set out that morning. Everything about him screamed alive, present, real. The forest around us felt suddenly claustrophobic, every tree a silent witness. I radioed dispatch with an update, keeping my tone deliberately bland. "Found subject alive. Appears disoriented, but ambulatory. No immediate medical concerns." I did not mention the name. I did not mention the body from the day before. The radio crackled in acknowledgement, and that was that. As we began the slow walk back toward the trailhead, Evan fell into step beside me, without prompting, matching my pace with uncanny ease. He kept glancing at me, not anxiously, but with something like expectation, as if waiting for me to confirm a shared understanding. The others walked ahead and behind, maintaining spacing, conversation minimal. The forest swallowed our footsteps, sound dampened by thick moss and layered needles. "Did you fix the watch?" he asked casually. I stopped walking. The team ahead took another few steps before realizing I wasn't following. Evan stopped, too, turning to face me, confusion flickering across his features. "What?" he said. "Did I say something wrong?" "What watch?" I asked. He blinked. "Mine. It stopped yesterday. You said it happens sometimes. Told me not to worry about it." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Show me." He lifted his wrist without hesitation. The watch was identical to the one on the body we'd recovered the day before. Same make, same scuffs, same cracked edge on the casing. The second hand moved. The minute hand did not. Frozen at 2:17. I forced myself to look away, to breathe, to regain control before the situation spiraled. "We'll take a look at it later," I said. "Let's keep moving." He nodded, satisfied, as if I'd confirmed something he already believed. We walked on. The debrief at the station was tense. Word travels fast in close-knit teams, and it didn't take long for questions to surface. How was it possible that a declared deceased subject had been found alive? Why did his records show a closed case? Why did he seem to recognize personnel he shouldn't have met? I fielded what I could, deflected what I couldn't, leaned heavily on procedural language and the assumption of clerical error. The body from the previous day hadn't yet been officially identified beyond preliminary confirmation. I quietly requested the remains be held pending further review, citing discrepancies that required resolution. The request was approved with visible reluctance. Evan was given food, water, a medical check. He passed every test. His vitals were normal. His blood work showed nothing unusual beyond mild stress markers. He answered questions willingly, if somewhat inconsistently. Dates blurred. Locations overlapped. He insisted he'd never left the forest for more than a day, despite records placing his disappearance 6 years earlier. When asked about his family, he hesitated, brow furrowing. "They moved," he said finally. "I think, or I was supposed to visit. I can't remember which." The psychologist assigned to his evaluation pulled me aside afterward, her expression carefully neutral. "He's not malingering," she said. "Whatever's going on, he believes his account. But there are gaps, significant ones. It's like pages torn out of a book." That night, I stayed late, poring over files until the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and the building settled into its after-hours quiet. I pulled Evan's original case again, reading it line by line, searching for details I might have missed. The timeline was clear. He'd gone missing during a solo hike, last seen entering a section of forest not far from where we'd found him now. The search had lasted weeks. Only partial remains were recovered: clothing, a bone fragment, enough to justify closure, but not enough for certainty. I cross-referenced other cases from the same area. That was when the pattern emerged. Not identical cases, not obvious duplicates, but subtle repetitions. Names that appeared more than once, years apart. Descriptions that felt eerily similar. Subjects found alive after being declared missing, only to disappear again later. Discrepancies brushed aside as database errors, identity confusion, bureaucratic noise. Individually, each case could be rationalized. Together, they formed something else entirely. A knock on the office door made me jump. Evan stood there, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, looking uncomfortable. "They said I could leave," he said. "But I figured I should check with you first." I studied him for a long moment, searching for cracks, for signs of deception. There were none. He was just a man, tired and confused, waiting for permission. "Sit down," I said. He did, perching on the edge of the chair across from my desk. The silence stretched. Finally, he spoke. "You don't remember, do you? Remember what?" "The other times." He shrugged slightly. "I didn't think you would. You never do." A chill crept up my spine. "How many times do you think this has happened?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again, gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I remember being found. I remember being cold. I remember talking to you. Then things get fuzzy. Like a bad signal." "What about the times you weren't found?" I asked. He looked up sharply. "Those are worse." I leaned back, heart pounding. "Tell me." He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Sometimes I wake up somewhere else. Not the forest, rooms, hallways, bright lights that hum, people asking questions they don't write down. They tell me they're trying to fix something, that I'm helping." "Helping what?" He shook his head. "They don't say. Or maybe they do, and I just don't keep it." My mouth felt dry. "Do you remember how you leave those places?" A faint smile touched his lips, humorless. "No, I just end up back out there. Same spot, usually. Like I never left." I checked the time without thinking. 2:12. "Evan," I said slowly, "I need you to stay here tonight." He nodded immediately. "Okay, lockdown," I added. "No, leaving the building." "Okay. You can't go back into the forest." His expression faltered for just a moment. "I don't think that's up to me." Before I could respond, the lights flickered, just once. A brief dip in illumination, barely noticeable, but enough to make the room feel suddenly wrong. The hum of the fluorescent lights shifted pitch, settling into a lower frequency that vibrated faintly through the desk beneath my hands. Evan stiffened, eyes darting toward the ceiling. "It's early," he murmured. "What's early?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and grabbed my wrist, fingers tightening painfully. "Don't let them take me again," he said, voice urgent. "Please." The clock on the wall ticked loudly. 2:16. I pulled my hand free and stood, adrenaline surging. "No one's taking you anywhere," I said. "You're safe here." He looked at me with something like pity. "That's what you said last time." The hum intensified, spreading through the building, rattling vents, setting my teeth on edge. I ran for the door, shouting for assistance, for anyone, but the hallway beyond was empty, lights flickering in uneven pulses. Evan backed away from the desk, breathing fast, eyes fixed on a point just behind me. "I can hear it," he whispered. "It's starting." The air felt thick, charged, as if a storm were building indoors. My watch vibrated against my wrist, the second hand racing. 2:17. The world lurched, not violently, not dramatically. It was more like a skipped frame, a moment where reality failed to load properly before snapping back into place. The hum vanished. The lights stabilized. The building exhaled. Evan was gone. The chair across from my desk lay overturned, one leg bent at an impossible angle. The room smelled faintly of ozone and something metallic, sharp and unfamiliar. I stood there, chest heaving, trying to make sense of the emptiness where a living person had been seconds earlier. Dispatch crackled over the radio at my hip. "We've got a signal," a voice said. "Unknown source. Deep woods. Same area as before." I closed my eyes. "Send coordinates," I said. When I opened them again, my reflection stared back at me from the darkened window. For a split second, it didn't move when I did. Then the radio crackled again. And the voice added hesitantly, "You're not going to like this." The ID attached to the signal. "It's Evan Mercer. Same as the body we recovered yesterday." I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. Outside, the forest waited. The forest looked the same as it always did when we went back out that night, but the familiarity felt like mockery. Headlamps cut narrow tunnels through the dark, light scattering against wet bark and low-hanging branches, every beam stopping just short of where certainty should have begun. The coordinates dispatch had sent led us back toward the same stretch of woodland we'd already searched. Twice in 48 hours, a place that should have been exhausted of surprises. Instead, it felt newly hostile, as if it resented our persistence. The signal was intermittent, pulsing on and off at irregular intervals, never quite stabilizing long enough to triangulate cleanly. GPS units lagged, recalculating positions that shifted by meters without explanation. Radios hissed with static that sounded almost patterned if you listened too long. No one said it out loud, but the unease was collective, heavy enough to weigh down every step. We found Evan just after midnight. He was standing in the middle of a clearing we hadn't marked before, perfectly still, head tilted slightly as if listening to something just beyond our range. The clearing itself was wrong, circular in a way nature rarely manages. The ground unnaturally flat, vegetation pressed down as if something had repeatedly emerged there. No footprints led in or out. It was as if the forest had arranged the space specifically for him. "Evan," I called out, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. He turned slowly, relief flooding his features. "You came faster this time," he said. My chest tightened. "You vanished from the station," I said carefully. "Do you remember that?" He nodded. "Yeah, that part's always rough. Always," I repeated. He shrugged. "It doesn't stick. Not for you, not for me either, most of the time. But I know it happens." As we approached, I noticed the details that didn't line up. His clothes were dry despite the damp air. His boots were clean. His face showed no signs of exertion. No sweat, no dirt. He looked like a man who'd stepped out of a photograph rather than trekked through miles of forest. "Did you walk here?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, I don't think so." "What do you remember?" He hesitated, eyes unfocusing slightly. "Light, noise, pressure, like being squeezed through something too small. Then, this." He gestured vaguely at the clearing. "Sometimes I hear people arguing before it happens. Other times, it's quiet." "Who argues?" one of the team asked. Evan looked at him blankly. "I don't know. I don't see their faces." We brought him back again. There was no alternative. Leaving him out there felt unthinkable, even as a part of me suspected the forest didn't care where he was housed. The drive back was silent, headlights carving through darkness that seemed thicker than before, as if the night itself were resisting illumination. I checked my watch repeatedly, dreading the approach of that familiar minute, but it passed without incident. No flicker, no hum, just time, stubbornly normal. At the station, chaos waited. The body we'd recovered the previous day was gone, not misplaced, not moved. Gone. The secure holding area showed no signs of forced entry. The access log was intact. No anomalies, no unexplained clearances. According to the system, the remains had never been there at all. The coroner stood pale and shaken, swearing he'd completed preliminary examinations only hours earlier. The paperwork that had documented the body's intake no longer existed. Files corrupted, backups empty, digital traces erased, so cleanly it was as if the record had been rewritten rather than deleted. Evan watched the confusion unfold with a weary resignation that made my skin crawl. "This is the part where you start doubting yourself," he said quietly, standing beside me as staff scrambled around the room. It's okay. It happens every time. I pulled him aside, away from the others. What do you mean, every time? He met my gaze steadily. This isn't the first loop, he said. It's just the first one you've noticed. The words landed with a dull finality. Loop implies a beginning, I said, and an end. Not exactly, he replied. More like overlaps. I spent the next several hours doing something I hadn't done in years. Pulling physical files, old storage, paper records that predated the digital systems everyone trusted without question. The archives were cold and smelled faintly of dust and ozone, the lights buzzing weakly overhead. I worked methodically, scanning dates, names, locations, cross-referencing missing persons cases with SAR logs and recovery reports. The pattern was undeniable now. Not just Evan Mercer, others too. Names that appeared multiple times across decades, sometimes with small variations, sometimes identical down to personal details that should have aged, changed, shifted. Photographs that showed the same faces at different points in time, unchanged. Recovery notes that contradicted one another, timelines that bent and overlapped like badly aligned transparencies. What chilled me most wasn't the repetition. It was the consistency. Every anomaly traced back to the same stretch of forest. Every case involved a disappearance followed by either an incomplete recovery or an impossible return. And woven through the margins of older reports were references I hadn't noticed before, redacted sections, vague mentions of external coordination, directives to limit dissemination, pending further analysis. I found the first reference to the facility just before dawn. It wasn't labeled as such, just a maintenance note from decades earlier referencing Saichi, a disasechi scheduled for decommissioning, located deep in restricted land. No map, no description, just a line item buried among dozens of others. The designation made my pulse spike. A 17. 217. I brought the file to my supervisor, laid everything out as calmly as I could. He listened in silence, his face betraying nothing. When I finished, he closed the folder and slid it back across the desk toward me. You need to stop, he said. People are being pulled out of time, I replied. This isn't clerical error. It's systematic. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. And if it is, then we're complicit, I said. He exhaled slowly. You're chasing shadows. There are explanations you don't have access to. That's not an answer, it's the only one you're getting. I left his office shaking with anger and something closer to fear. Evan sat in the common area, sipping water, eyes tracking me as I passed. They won't tell you, he said softly. They never do. Who's they? I asked. He shrugged. Depends which time you're asking. We decided to run an experiment. Nothing official. Nothing logged. Just a controlled observation. We placed Evan in a monitored room, cameras running, clocks synced to atomic time, redundant power sources in place. I stayed with him, refusing to leave as the afternoon wore on. The air felt charged, anticipation buzzing beneath my skin. What happens if I leave before it starts? He asked. I don't know, I said honestly. He smiled faintly. Neither do they. At 2:15, the room grew colder. At 2:16, the lights dimmed, just slightly. At 2:17, every clock in the room froze. The cameras continued recording. The footage later showed something I couldn't bring myself to watch more than once. Evan standing. Evan flickering. Evan splitting into overlapping frames, each offset by a fraction of a second. The air around him distorted, bending light inward. A shape emerged behind him, not fully visible, but present enough to register as pressure, as absence. Then Evan was gone. The room snapped back to normal, as if nothing had happened. The clocks resumed. The cameras kept rolling. We found Evan again, an hour later, not outside. Inside the archive room. He was sitting on the floor between shelves, head in his hands, breathing hard. He looked up when I approached, eyes wild. I saw it this time, he said. The place they take me, where? I asked. A lab, he said, or what's left of one. They didn't mean for it to keep running, but it did. And now it can't stop. I stared at him, heart pounding. Who built it? He swallowed. I think you did. I laughed, reflexively, the sound brittle. That's impossible. Not you, he clarified. Another version, older. You were wearing a different badge. You told them the forest would mask the effects. The room seemed to tilt. You said it was temporary, Evan continued. That once they understood the process, they'd shut it down. But something went wrong. Time didn't fold cleanly, it smeared. A chill ran through me. What's the lab doing now? He looked at me with something like fear. It's trying to correct itself. The implications unfurled in my mind, horrifying in their scope. A system designed to manipulate time, now malfunctioning, dumping fragments of people back into the forest when alignment failed. Evan wasn't a fluke. He was a symptom. How do we stop it? I asked. Evan shook his head slowly. You don't. Not cleanly. The radio crackled at my hip. We've got movement, dispatch said. Multiple signals. Same signature as before. How many? I asked. There was a pause. 3, the voice replied. And one of them matches you. I closed my eyes. Somewhere in the forest, something was opening again. The first thing I noticed as we moved toward the coordinates was how the forest resisted mapping. Paths that should have intersected didn't. Distances stretched and contracted. In subtle ways that made the GPS units argue with one another, their screens recalculating endlessly without settling on consensus. We split into smaller elements to triangulate the signals. But even that felt wrong, like the land itself objected to being partitioned. Evan walked beside me, quiet now, eyes unfocused, as if listening to something that hadn't decided whether to speak aloud. The signal that matched me pulsed strongest the farther we went. That fact lodged itself in my chest like a cold stone. Dispatch tried to rationalize it over the radio. Equipment interference, ID duplication, signal bleed, but none of it landed. I could feel the pull, a faint pressure behind my eyes that aligned too neatly with direction to dismiss. We weren't searching anymore. We were being guided. The trees thinned abruptly, not into a clearing, but into something more deliberate. The ground leveled, vegetation giving way to compacted soil that bore the faint scars of old construction. Concrete fragments jutted through moss like bones, half swallowed by time. A rusted chain-link fence traced a perimeter that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Its posts bent and twisted, the gate long since torn free and discarded into the undergrowth. This isn't on any map, one of the team murmured. It used to be, Evan said quietly. They erased it when it stopped being useful. We followed a narrow service road that dipped into a shallow cut in the earth, the canopy closing overhead until daylight thinned to a dim wash of gray. The air changed as we descended, cooler, heavier, carrying a faint metallic temps that had no place in the forest. The hum I'd felt before returned, not loud enough to hear, but strong enough to register, vibrating through the soles of my boots. The facility revealed itself without ceremony. A concrete structure embedded into the hillside, its facade stained with decades of runoff, doors sealed with heavy steel plates that bore warning markings, half obliterated by rust. The signage was old, utilitarian, the kind designed to discourage curiosity rather than invite compliance. Authorized personnel only. Experimental zone. Do not enter during active cycle. Active cycle. The doors were ajar, not forced, not broken, simply open, as if the place had been waiting. Inside, the air was still, unnaturally so, the silence pressing in around us with uncomfortable intimacy. Our headlamps illuminated a wide corridor lined with conduits and cables that snaked along the walls and ceiling, disappearing into darkness beyond their reach. The concrete underfoot was smooth, worn by traffic that had stopped long ago. Dust lay undisturbed, except for a single set of footprints leading deeper inside. They were mine. I stopped abruptly, the others piling up behind me in confusion. I crouched, tracing the outline with my light, heart pounding. Same boot tread. Same wear pattern. Same slight drag on the left heel. Fresh hours old, at most. I told you, Evan said softly. You've been here. The corridor sloped downward gradually, branching into side passages that had been hastily sealed off with welded plates and warning tape that had long since lost its adhesive strength. Old monitors hung dark and lifeless on the walls, their glass spider-webbed with cracks. In one corner, a clock lay shattered on the floor, its face frozen at 2:17. We moved carefully, every sense straining. Radios crackled uselessly, reduced to static, punctuated by brief, unintelligible bursts That might have been voices, if you wanted to believe that. The deeper we went, the more the facility felt occupied, not by people, but by intention. Systems still running long after their operators had abandoned them, executing protocols without oversight or understanding. We reached a control room that overlooked a vast chamber below. The glass was reinforced, thick enough to distort the view, but the space beyond was unmistakable. Rows of machinery encircled a central platform, cables descending like roots into a structure that defied immediate comprehension. It wasn't a machine in the conventional sense. It was a convergence point, a place where multiple systems fed into one another, their outputs looping back into inputs in ways that made my head ache to follow. "What is this?" someone whispered. Evan stepped closer to the glass, his breath fogging its surface. "This is where it happens," he said. "Where they pull us out." I scanned the control panels, fingers brushing dust from labels that made my stomach churn. Temporal phase stabilizer, localized displacement array, anchor integrity monitor. Each system had status lights that flickered weakly, oscillating between green and amber without ever settling. A cluster of monitors displayed camera feeds from around the forest, trails, clearings, places I recognized. Each feed bore a timestamp. Every single one read 2:17. I checked my watch. 2:19. The discrepancy felt like a physical blow. "You see it, don't you?" Evan said, turning to me. They locked it to that minute. Something about stability. They thought if they could isolate a single moment, they could work around it. "Work around what?" I asked. "Time," he replied. A terminal in the corner flickered to life, as if responding to the conversation, lines of code scrolling across the screen too fast to read. The system beeped, a sharp, insistent sound that echoed through the chamber. Somewhere below, machinery groaned, heavy components shifting reluctantly after years of dormancy. "Someone's triggered a cycle," one of the team said, panic creeping into his voice. "I didn't touch anything," I replied, though the words felt inadequate. Evan's gaze snapped to me. "You don't have to," he said. "It knows you're here." The central platform below began to glow faintly, lines etched into its surface, lighting up in a pattern that made no intuitive sense. The hum intensified, finally audible now, a deep vibration that rattled teeth and bones alike. The air shimmered, bending light inward toward the platform's center. And then, something appeared, not fully, not cleanly. A human shape coalesced in overlapping layers, each iteration offset by fractions of a second, like a stuttering film reel. I recognized the posture immediately, the stance, the way the shoulders hunched slightly, as if bracing against cold. It was me, or rather, versions of me. One younger, one older, one injured, each occupying the same space, without quite aligning. Their faces flickered between expressions, confusion, fear, grim acceptance, cycling too quickly to settle. The sight stole the breath from my lungs. "That's not possible," I said hoarsely. Evan didn't look away. "That's the anchor," he said. "They use you to stabilize the return." The machine's lights surged, the hum spiking sharply. The overlapping figures began to separate, each pulling in a different direction, as if the system were struggling to decide which one to keep. Alarms blared, harsh and discordant, drowning out everything else. "Shut it down," someone shouted. I lunged for the controls, slamming my hand against the emergency cutoff. Nothing happened. The system ignored me, cycling relentlessly through its sequence. On one of the monitors, a new feed appeared, a camera angle from deep in the forest, showing a clearing I knew intimately. Evan stood at its center, alone, looking directly into the lens. But Evan was standing beside me. The Evan on the screen opened his mouth and spoke. "Don't," he said. The alarms cut out abruptly. The hum dropped to a low, menacing thrum. The overlapping figures on the platform collapsed inward, light flaring blindingly bright before snapping out of existence. The chamber fell silent, the sudden absence of sound more unsettling than the noise had been. We stood there, stunned, trying to process what we'd seen. The smell of ozone hung thick in the air, sharp enough to sting the eyes. The monitors continued to display to 17, unmoving. Evan sagged against the railing, breathing hard. "They're running out of room," he said. "Every time it fails, it dumps the excess back into the forest. That's why there are more of us now, more signals." It's losing alignment. I turned to him slowly. Why me? He met my gaze, eyes haunted. Because you're consistent, he said. Across versions, you make the same choices. You come back. That makes you useful. The weight of that settled over me like a suffocating blanket. All the unexplained pulls, the familiarity the forest had always held for me. The sense of being nudged into place. It wasn't coincidence. I wasn't an observer. I was part of the mechanism. The radio crackled suddenly, startling us all. Dispatch's voice came through distorted, urgent. We've got multiple new signals, they said. They're everywhere. Trails, roads, even near the station. How many? I asked. There was a long pause, too many to count. The facility shuddered, the hum rising again as systems attempted to compensate for something spiraling beyond control. Evan straightened, resolve hardening his features. It's starting to break, he said. And when it does, it won't be subtle. I looked back at the platform, at the place where my other selves had flickered into being, and felt a cold certainty settle into my bones. We hadn't found the source of the problem. We'd found the reason it couldn't stop. The facility didn't shut down when the alarm stopped. It listened instead. That was the only way I could describe the sensation, a low, attentive stillness that settled into the walls and floor, as if the structure itself were waiting for the next instruction. The hum remained, quieter now, woven into the background like a distant engine idling somewhere underground. The others stood frozen, uncertain whether movement would trigger another cycle or be ignored entirely. Evan broke the silence first. They never meant to keep using people, he said, voice rough. Not at the start. I turned to him slowly. Then what was the plan? He looked around the chamber, at the dormant machinery, the screens locked to that single cursed minute. Containment, he said. They weren't trying to travel through time. They were trying to hold it still. The idea was obscene in its simplicity. Freeze a moment, isolate it, study it. Use it as a buffer against instability they didn't yet understand. The forest had been chosen because it was already geologically volatile, temporally unpredictable in subtle ways humans had learned to ignore. Geysers, fault lines, magnetic anomalies. Time already behaved strangely here. The lab had just tried to formalize it. I moved closer to one of the terminals, wiping grime from the screen with my sleeve. Old logs scrolled past, timestamps overlapping, entries repeating with slight variations. The early records were confident, clinical, full of language that assumed control was inevitable. Phase lock achieved. Anchor stable. Subject recovered with minimal drift. Later entries grew shorter, more cautious, then desperate. Anchor degradation accelerating. Return alignment failing. Excess displacement cannot be reabsorbed. What does that mean? Someone asked quietly. It means they broke it, I said. And instead of stopping, they kept compensating. Evan nodded. Every time the system failed to realign someone properly, it tried again. Pulled them back out. Reset them. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. The failures were messy. I thought of the partial remains from Evan's original case, of others like him, people who hadn't come back, whole or at all. They figured out pretty quickly that shutting it down wasn't an option. Evan continued. The moment they tried, things spiked. Time didn't collapse inward like they expected. It spilled. Into the forest, I said. Yes, the forest wasn't the problem. It was the spillway. The buffer zone, where misaligned returns could be dumped without immediately tearing reality open. The missing hikers, the returned dead, the living duplicates. They weren't accidents. They were pressure releases. I felt sick. So they let it keep running, I said. Because stopping it would have been worse. And because it needed anchors, Evan added. I closed my eyes briefly, the weight of that word pressing down on me. People, I said. It needed people. Consistent ones, he said. People whose timelines were resilient. You, for example. A memory surfaced unbidden, the overlapping versions of myself on the platform. Each pulled from a different point, along a path I hadn't consciously chosen. I remembered the sensation of being nudged into situations, of paths opening just enough to funnel me toward the right place at the right time. I had thought it was instinct, experience, luck. It had been calibration. They didn't tell you, Evan said quietly. Not the first time, or the second. They let you forget. But you always came back when the system needed stabilizing. Why don't you forget? I asked. He hesitated. Because I never stabilized, he said. I fractured. They kept trying to fix me, but every version came back worse. Eventually, I stopped lining up at all. Now I just bounce. The facility trembled faintly beneath our feet, the hum shifting pitch. They're losing control, Evan said. Whatever automated processes are left can't compensate anymore. Too many failures. Too much excess. The radio crackled at my hip, dispatch's voice breaking through in panicked bursts. We've got sightings everywhere, they said. People appearing out of nowhere. Some hurt, some confused, some not responding at all. We don't have the resources for this. I looked around the chamber, at the systems that had quietly shaped decades of disappearances, and felt a surge of anger that cut through the fear. Then we shut it down, I said. Controlled or not. Evan's expression hardened. You don't understand, he said. It's not a machine anymore. It's a loop that learned how to sustain itself. As if summoned by his words, the central platform flickered back to life. The etched lines glowed faintly, pulsing in irregular patterns. The monitors began cycling through feeds rapidly, images blurring as the system struggled to reconcile conflicting inputs. Forest trails, roads, the station parking lot, places that should have been temporarily stable, now bore the telltale distortions I'd come to dread. On one screen, a man stumbled out of the woods, collapsing at the edge of a highway. On another, a woman stood frozen mid-step on a trail, her image jittering as if caught between frames. On a third, a familiar face looked back at me, my own, older, bloodied, shouting silently as the feed cut out. The alarms returned, louder this time, overlapping in chaotic dissonance. The facility shook, dust raining down from the ceiling as systems overloaded. Evan grabbed my arm, pulling me back from the console. It's accelerating, he said. The more it fails, the more it tries to correct. And the more it corrects, the more it fails, I finished. He nodded grimly. I scanned the control panels, searching for anything that resembled a manual override, a failsafe, some last resort option the original designers might have included. Most of the systems were locked behind layers of authorization long since invalid. But one panel, half hidden behind a collapsed rack, caught my eye. Its label was faded, the text barely legible. Anchor, override. My pulse quickened. I moved closer, brushing away debris to reveal a recessed switch beneath a cracked plastic cover. The accompanying documentation was sparse, handwritten notes taped haphazardly around the panel. Use only if automated stabilization fails. Manual alignment required. Anchor integrity not guaranteed. What happens if I use this? I asked. Evan followed my gaze, his expression tightening. It forces the system to lock onto a single anchor, he said. One version, one timeline. Everything else gets rejected. Rejected how? He swallowed. Dumped. Into the forest. Into whatever space the system could still access. All the excess versions, all the failed returns, expelled at once. How many? Someone asked. Evan didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked to the monitors, to the countless flickering feeds. Too many, he said finally. And if we don't? I asked. The system keeps fragmenting, he said. Eventually the buffer won't be enough. The spill will reach populated areas. Cities. The room fell silent, except for the alarms and the deep, relentless hum. I understood then what the experiments had really been for. Not progress, not discovery. Survival. Not of individuals, but of the broader timeline. The lab had sacrificed people to keep something worse at bay, and now, even that grim balance was failing. I placed my hand on the override switch, which anchor I asked quietly. Evan met my gaze, eyes steady. You already know. The implications settled heavily between us. The system had always chosen me when it needed consistency. It would do so again. But this time, it wouldn't let go. What happens to me? I asked. You stabilize it, he said. Or you disappear into it. Either way, there's no coming back clean. The alarms surged to a crescendo, the facility groaning as if under immense strain. On the monitors, figures began appearing faster now, images overlapping, the forest bleeding into roads and buildings. Time was tearing itself loose from its moorings. I thought of the people already lost, of the bodies we'd recovered, the families who'd buried empty coffins, of Evan, caught in an endless loop of partial returns, of myself, unknowingly complicit, walking the same paths over and over because the system had learned I would. I flipped the cover open. The switch was warm to the touch, vibrating faintly beneath my fingers. Evan stepped back, giving me space. "If you do this," he said, "the system will lock you in. You'll be the reference point. Everything else will be measured against you, and you." I asked. A sad smile crossed his face. "I'm excess," he said. "Always have been." The hum deepened, the sound now almost vocal in its intensity. I felt the pressure behind my eyes spike, a familiar sensation magnified 100-fold. Time itself seemed to lean toward the decision, waiting. I took a breath and pulled the switch. The world screamed. Light exploded outward from the platform, blinding, searing, the air tearing itself apart as reality convulsed. I felt myself stretch, awareness pulled in opposing directions. Every version of me the system had ever catalogued, slamming together in a violent convergence. Memories overlapped, bled into one another. Trails walked, bodies found, conversations repeated, with slight variations. Through it all, one thought anchored me. Hold. The hum peaked, then shattered, collapsing into silence, so abrupt it felt like falling into a void. The alarms died mid-scream. The light vanished. When sensation returned, I was on my knees, on the cold concrete floor, gasping, my head pounding as if I'd been struck. The facility was dark now, emergency lights flickering weakly along the walls. The monitors were blank. I looked up, heart racing. Evan was gone, not displaced, not duplicated, gone. Outside, the forest waited, heavy with the weight of what had just been done. And somewhere, deep within the system that now bore my imprint, something had stabilized. At a cost I hadn't yet begun to understand. When the light faded, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary absence of sound you get when alarms cut out or machinery powers down, but a deeper, more oppressive stillness, as if the air itself were holding its breath. The hum that had threaded through the facility, for as long as I'd been aware of it, was gone, leaving behind a hollow pressure that made my ears ring. For a moment, I wondered if I'd gone deaf. Then I heard my own breathing, ragged, uneven, too loud in the emptiness, and knew the silence was real. I stayed on the floor longer than necessary, palms pressed against cold concrete, waiting for the inevitable surge of pain or disorientation that usually followed temporal shifts. It didn't come. Instead, there was a strange clarity, a sharpening of sensation that made every detail feel unnaturally precise. I could feel the vibration of emergency lights through the walls, the faint tremor of my pulse against my fingertips, the exact point where the floor dipped imperceptibly beneath my weight. It was as if the world had snapped into a higher resolution. I pushed myself upright slowly. The chamber looked smaller now. Not physically altered, but diminished somehow, stripped of the layered distortions that had once given it depth beyond dimension. The central platform was dark, its etched lines inert, no glow, no pulse. Cables lay slack, their ends scorched and fused. Whatever process had been running here had stopped, or at least, it had changed enough to no longer announce itself. "Evan," I called out. My voice echoed back flatly, unchanged. No overlap, no delay. The absence of response settled heavily. Evan hadn't been displaced. He hadn't fractured or reappeared elsewhere. He was simply gone, dumped, like he'd said. Excess expelled from a system that could no longer afford inefficiency. The weight of that pressed into me as I made my way through the facility, checking rooms out of habit rather than hope. The control room was inert, screens blank, terminals unresponsive. The archives beyond it were a mess of half-corrupted data and handwritten notes that now seemed almost obscene in there. Casualness, names, dates, iterations, lives reduced to variables and thresholds. I understood then that whatever human oversight had once existed here had been eroded long before I arrived. The system hadn't just outlived its creators, it had absorbed their intent and continued without them. The radio crackled faintly at my hip, startling me. "Hello?" a voice said. "If anyone's there." We've got reports coming in. I grabbed it, relief and dread tangling in my chest. This is search-led, I said. I'm here. The pause that followed was long enough to be unsettling. You dropped off our system for almost 40 minutes, dispatch said finally. We thought we lost you. How are things topside? I asked. Another pause. Quieter, they said. Too quiet. They told me the sightings had stopped abruptly. People who'd appeared out of nowhere vanished again just as suddenly. Trails that had glitched back into existence smoothed themselves out. GPS units stabilized. Watches resumed normal function. On paper, it looked like resolution. In practice, it felt wrong. I emerged from the facility just before dawn, the forest washed in pale light that revealed nothing of what lay beneath its surface. The air smelled clean, crisp, deceptively normal. Birds called tentatively, as if unsure whether it was safe to resume their routines. I stood there longer than necessary, scanning the tree line for movement that never came. The walk back was uneventful. That should have comforted me. It didn't. At the station, the mood was cautiously optimistic. Reports were being closed. Alerts downgraded. The phrase temporal anomaly disappeared from internal communications, replaced by more palatable explanations. Equipment malfunction, environmental interference, stress-induced misperception. The forest, it seemed, had once again swallowed its secrets neatly enough to satisfy the system. I was called into a meeting mid-morning. 3 people sat across from me in a conference room I didn't recognize, their expressions carefully neutral. They didn't introduce themselves, and I didn't ask. They already knew who I was. They always had. We're aware you accessed a restricted site, one of them said calmly, and that you initiated a manual override. I met his gaze. It was failing. Yes, he agreed. And now it's stabilized. Define stabilized, I said. He smiled faintly. Contained. I leaned back in my chair, the motion drawing a subtle ripple of attention from the others. Evan Mercer is gone, I said. So are others like him. Another nod. Regrettable, but acceptable losses. Anger flared, hot and sharp. He was a person. So are you, the woman beside him said gently. And yet here you are. The implication was clear. I had been weighed, measured, chosen. They explained what they could, or rather, what they deemed necessary. The override had forced the system to collapse into a single dominant timeline. Mine, everything else that didn't align closely enough, had been rejected. Expelled into the buffer zone until it could no longer sustain them. The forest absorbed the rest, the man said, as it always does. And what happens now? I asked. Now, he said, we monitor. I laughed quietly, the sound hollow even to my own ears. You can't shut it down. No, he agreed. We've learned that. The meeting ended without ceremony. No debrief. No acknowledgement of what I'd done beyond a tacit understanding that it would not be spoken of again. I returned to my desk, feeling strangely detached, as if I were watching myself from a slight distance, every movement too deliberate, too precise. That was when the headaches started, not sharp pain, but pressure. A constant awareness at the base of my skull, pulsing in time with something I couldn't hear. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to exhaustion, stress, dehydration. But it persisted, growing more pronounced whenever I approached the forest, whenever my watch ticked closer to that familiar minute. 2:17. I began to notice other changes. Time felt sticky. Moments lingered longer than they should have, stretching out before snapping forward abruptly. Conversations repeated themselves with minor variations, words echoing half a second late. Once, I watched a colleague cross the room and had the distinct sensation that I was seeing it happen for the second time, though I couldn't recall the first. I checked the mirrors compulsively. My reflection always moved when I did, but sometimes it felt delayed in ways too subtle to confirm, like a breath held just a fraction too long. I stopped sleeping through the night. When I did sleep, I dreamed of corridors and humming lights, of standing still while versions of myself passed by in opposite directions, each one carrying a piece of something I'd lost. I tried to avoid the forest. It didn't help. The pull was still there, muted but insistent, a quiet alignment that nudged me towards certain paths, certain times. I'd find myself driving toward trailheads without consciously deciding to, my hands turning the wheel as if guided by muscle memory rather than intent. When I realized what I was doing, I'd stop, heart racing, the sense of wrongness lingering long after I turned back. Reports trickled in. Nothing dramatic. No disappearances. Just oddities. A hiker insisting they'd been gone for hours when their companions swore it had only been minutes. A trail camera, capturing the same person walking past at slightly different times, each image stamped with conflicting metadata. A radio transmission echoing itself back a second late, the voice overlapping its own words. The system flagged them as noise. I knew better. One afternoon, I found myself standing at the edge of the forest without remembering how I'd gotten there. The trees loomed ahead, their shadows long and familiar, the air humming faintly with something just below hearing. I checked my watch. 2:16. My heart pounded. I took a step back, then another, breaking eye contact with the tree line. The pressure eased slightly, but didn't vanish. "You can't avoid it forever," a voice said behind me. I spun around, pulse racing. No one stood there, but the words lingered, resonating inside my chest rather than my ears. Not Evan's voice, not mine. Something layered, familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. I realized then what the override had really done. The system hadn't shut down. It had bound itself to me. I was the anchor now. Not actively, not consciously, but fundamentally. My presence, my continuity, my choices, they were the reference point against which everything else aligned. As long as I existed, as long as I moved forward in time without breaking, the system could recalibrate around me. And if I ever failed, I backed away from the forest slowly, never turning my back, the sense of being observed intensifying with every step. The moment passed without incident. The world continued, but the knowledge stayed. They hadn't ended the experiments. They'd just changed who was running them. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the pressure in my head surged sharply, then eased. My watch vibrated faintly on the bedside table. 2:17. Somewhere deep in the forest, something adjusted. And I understood with chilling clarity that the final question was no longer whether the system would fail. It was how long I could hold it together. The first time I failed to notice the shift, it was raining. Not a storm, not even a downpour. Just that steady, persistent drizzle that settles into everything and makes the world feel smaller. I was halfway through a routine patrol along the edge of a trail that had never officially closed, but rarely saw foot traffic anymore. The forest was muted, color leached away by the low clouds pressing down overhead. My boots sank slightly into the damp earth with each step, the sound dull and repetitive, grounding in a way I clung to more than I cared to admit. I checked my watch out of habit. 2:14. The pressure behind my eyes tightened immediately, a sensation I had learned to recognize as surely as hunger or fatigue. It wasn't pain, it was alignment. The sense that something was adjusting around me, calibrating itself to my position in time and space. I stopped walking, breath fogging in the cool air, and waited. Nothing happened. The forest remained still. The rain continued its soft, indifferent tapping against leaves and jacket fabric. Birds shifted in the canopy, unconcerned. For a moment, hope flickered, fragile, unwanted. Maybe the system really had stabilized. Maybe the pull was fading. Then I realized I'd lost time. Not much. Seconds, maybe a minute. But enough that the transition registered as absence rather than movement. I was standing in the same spot, posture unchanged, but my watch now read to 18. The pressure eased. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep walking. That became the pattern. Small gaps. Minor slips. Moments that refused to account for themselves. They never announced their arrival. They simply recurred, leaving behind a faint sense of dislocation. Like stepping onto a stair you thought was there, and finding empty air instead. The world always resumed seamlessly afterward. To seamlessly, I stopped reporting them. There was no protocol for losing less than a minute. No form for logging the absence of something you couldn't prove had been present to begin with. And deep down, I knew the truth. The system didn't need documentation anymore. It had me. The forest responded accordingly. I began to notice subtle changes in places I'd walked for years. Trails that felt slightly shorter than I remembered. Clearings that seemed to open a fraction earlier than expected. Trees that bore fresh scars I couldn't recall marking. None of it was dramatic enough to alarm anyone else, but to me it felt like the land was smoothing itself around my movements, adjusting to keep me centered. Anchored, the headaches worsened. They came in waves now, surging at irregular intervals, rather than clustering around that cursed minute. When they peaked, my vision blurred at the edges, the world flattening into layers that struggled to align. I learned to ride them out, breathing slowly, grounding myself in physical sensation until the pressure receded. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want the attention. I understood too well how easily concern could turn into containment. Sleep became unreliable. When I slept, I dreamed of standing still while the world moved around me. People passed by, unaware, their faces familiar but wrong in small, unsettling ways. Some were older than they should have been, others younger. A few were impossible faces I recognized from photographs, from old files, from cases that had never quite resolved. They never spoke. They just looked at me as they went, expressions unreadable. I started leaving lights on at night, not because I was afraid of the dark, but because darkness made it easier to forget where I was. The first real failure happened 3 months after the override. It began as a routine call. Lost camper, late 20s, inexperienced but not reckless. Last known location near a trailhead that had seen a handful of odd reports recently. Nothing actionable, just enough to make me uneasy. I volunteered to lead the search before anyone else could. Control, I'd learned, was the only thing that slowed the drift. We found her alive less than an hour in. She was sitting against a tree, arms wrapped tightly around herself, eyes wide and unfocused. She looked up as we approached and smiled weakly, relief evident. "I knew you'd come," she said. I froze. She frowned, confusion flickering across her face. "You did last time," she added hesitantly. The team exchanged glances behind me, unease rippling through the group. I forced a smile and knelt in front of her, keeping my voice steady. "I think you're confused," I said. She shook her head slowly. "No. You were wearing the same jacket. You told me to stay here, said you had to check something." My watch vibrated faintly against my wrist. 2:16. I stood up too quickly, dizziness washing over me. The pressure surged, sharper than it had been in weeks, and for a split second, the forest blurred, colors smearing into one another as if reality itself were buffering. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay present. "We're taking you out," I said. "You're safe now." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on me with unsettling intensity. "You look tired," she said softly. "This part always wears you down." That night, the meeting I'd been avoiding finally happened. They didn't summon me. They didn't need to. I found myself in the conference room, without remembering the walk there. The 3 familiar figures waiting patiently, as if they'd known exactly when I'd arrive. No greetings were exchanged. No preamble offered. "You're experiencing degradation," the man said calmly. I laughed bitterly. "You mean I'm failing?" "Not yet," the woman replied. "But the signs are consistent." I leaned back in the chair, exhaustion settling into my bones. "What happens when I do?" They exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. "The system compensates," the man said finally. "As it always has." "By replacing me," I said. "Yes." The word hung in the air, heavy and inevitable. "With who?" I asked. "With the next most stable anchor," he replied. "Another version, another iteration." Understanding crashed into place with sickening clarity. The overlapping versions I'd seen on the platform. The signal that had once matched me in the forest. The reason I always came back. "You're already doing it," I said quietly. "You're already cycling me." The woman didn't deny it. "We ensure continuity. And what happens to the one that breaks?" I asked. She hesitated, just long enough. "Excess," she said. The same word Evan had used. I left the meeting without another word. Outside, the sky was clear, stars sharp and distant, indifferent to human systems and the costs they exacted. I drove aimlessly for hours, the forest pressing close on either side of the road, familiar and alien all at once. I felt watched, not by something external, but by the accumulated weight of my own persistence. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like recognition. I returned to the facility at dawn. It was harder to find than before, the forest reluctant to part. Paths resisting alignment, until I focused deliberately, letting the pull guide me rather than fighting it. The concrete structure emerged from the hillside, like a scar that refused to heal. Doors sealed once more, but yielding easily to my touch. Inside, the air hummed softly, systems responding to my presence with almost eager familiarity. Emergency lights flickered to life as I moved through the corridors, illuminating footprints that matched mine perfectly. Fresh, recent, overlapping in ways that suggested I had already walked these paths more times than I could count. The control room greeted me like an old friend. One monitor flickered on as I approached, displaying a single feed: the forest, empty and still, timestamp locked at 2:17. The anchor override panel glowed faintly, the switch reset to its original position, waiting. I understood now what had to happen. Stability wasn't a state, it was a process. One that required constant correction, constant sacrifice. As long as I remained partially misaligned, slipping minutes here, seconds there, the system could absorb the strain. But if I fractured fully, if I lost continuity altogether, it would replace me without hesitation. Unless I chose the replacement myself. I sat in the chair before the console and placed my hands on the controls. The hum intensified, responding to the contact, the pressure behind my eyes spiking sharply. Images flooded my mind, versions of myself, walking trails I didn't remember, making choices I hadn't consciously made, all converging toward this moment. I keyed in the sequence Evan had shown me, fingers moving with a certainty that felt borrowed rather than learned. The system acknowledged the input with a low chime, lights shifting from amber to steady green. Manual alignment required. I exhaled slowly. "This is you staying," I murmured to the empty room. "Not me." The final command triggered, without resistance. The world stretched, not violently. Gently, almost tenderly, like a hand pulling taffy into thin strands. Awareness expanded outward, my sense of self diffusing across moments and possibilities. I felt other versions of me recede, their presence thinning as the system collapsed inward, selecting a single, stable reference. The pain was immense, but distant, as if happening to someone else. When sensation returned, I was on the forest floor, damp earth pressed against my cheek, birds calling overhead. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, warm and reassuring. I pushed myself upright, slowly, heart pounding, breath coming in shallow bursts. My watch read 2:18. I stood, steady, whole in a way I hadn't felt in months. The pressure was gone. The pull had vanished. For the first time since the override, the forest felt like a place rather than a mechanism. I walked back to the trailhead alone. They closed the case quietly. The facility was sealed permanently, its location erased from records with a thoroughness that bordered on reverence. Reports of temporal anomalies ceased entirely. Disappearances dropped to baseline levels, tragic but explainable. The system, it seemed, had accepted the correction. I left search and rescue not long after. I don't go into forests anymore unless I have to. When I do, I keep my distance, sticking to marked trails, resisting the urge to wander. Sometimes, when the light hits just right, or the air grows unusually still, I feel a familiar tightening behind my eyes, a phantom sensation, an echo of alignment. It never lasts. I know better now. Stability was achieved, not by ending the system, but by giving it what it needed. If you ever find yourself deep in the woods and feel like time has skipped, just for a moment, check your watch. If the minute hand has moved when you didn't feel it, count yourself lucky. It means the anchor is still holding, and it means you weren't chosen.